Welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst on day 100 of self-quarantine, 100 days in. When I first arrived at my location of shelter in place, there were barely any cases, and now it is the epicenter, one of the epicenters of COVID. What 100 days. Businesses are opening up around the country. They've prematurely opened up in several states that have red leadership, Republican leadership, and they didn't do it with any, phasing in. So this is the state of our leadership. There's a lack of leadership around the country in responding to COVID. There's a lack of leadership in the Democratic Party in responding quickly enough to the COVID cases because they're too busy balancing their interests and going to committee meetings to decide whether or not, just how hard they want to push back against corporations. This is a crisis that stems from corporate systems. Just today, there was a report by ProPublica that showed that cases where there is privatized medicine, there's an extraordinary spike. Countries where there's privatized medicine, there's an extraordinary spike in cases. And socialized medicine, it has gone drastically down and almost eliminated the cases. So, it's not to say that I remember hearing when Italy had a spike in cases, people said, how does that happen? I mean, they have socialized medicine, but their response, the hospital system's response, you see it in Cuba, you see it in Italy, you see it in France now. They immediately took responsive action to protect its citizens. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't have the crisis in their country, but they responded to the crisis with the type of action needed. But when you involve business interests, and you couldn't be any more clear than in the red states like Arizona and Texas, the red states to the west of the Mississippi, how they opened up prematurely. And in some cases like Florida or Georgia, their governors were actually, and their families were invested in businesses that were hurting. So when you mix big business with government, whether you're a Republican who decides you're just going to open up the economy and pretend that COVID doesn't exist, and you're ruling by conspiracy theory and not even phasing in with masks, or whether you're a Democrat and you're sitting idle or quiet or taking time to process the CDC's information as they did in New York State and New York City. When you have to sit there and go back to your committee and say, how are we going to balance our business interests with the public health crisis? Then you are part of the problem. There is no in-between. There is no neoliberal answer to this, because all neoliberalism is a more woke version of capitalism. There's extreme, ruthless, callous capitalism that is almost openly racist and sexist and homophobic and colonial. And then there is the sanitized version of capitalism that is just as extreme, just as based in monopolies, just as Wall Street oriented, but creates an illusion of being supportive of the people. And that, as MLK Jr. so finely said, is almost just as dangerous. Just as dangerous. Because that map that ProPublica put up of countries of socialized medicine that have pretty much eliminated the COVID crisis, comparatively to countries like ourselves who have privatized medicine. Privatized hospitals are not just a thing that exists in Republican states. It happens in Democratic states too. It happens in Democratic cities, just as police departments are unregulated in Democratic-led cities. The crisis is neoliberalism. So that is why this week was just so powerful, seeing a slew of progressive victories against some of the lamest, crustiest, neoliberal power holders in our government. I'm not just talking about, Elliot Engel in Congress. I'm talking about local leadership. We're seeing district leaders in New York State in particular, in New York City being ousted. These are people who became complacent, in many cases were put in office by county committee, which is something that it's a very undemocratic process because, New York City, for the most part, is a Democratic run city. So there's no real general election against Republicans. So whoever the nominee is for the Democratic primary wins the seat. So many of our leadership from the local level up has been put in place by county committee. And that doesn't mean, that means that, you're the Democratic nominee, you're going to win. So the voters really don't have a say. And so what happens with those leaders is they're not used to being challenged. They're not used to running for election. They have no problem living in Maryland and not going back to the district. They have no problem ignoring the crisis of COVID or not understanding how COVID is affecting their communities. They have no problem not even showing up for photo ops. I mean, how ridiculous is it that these leaders are so crusty and so lazy and so unresponsive that they don't even have the politician's ego of showing up for photo ops? This is the crisis that we're facing. And while we had a great night and we had some very big wins, we have to be clear that there were a lot of folks that did not have as favorable as results. And I, from the bottom of my heart, personally, I hope that these people run again. I hope that for every Eliot Engel that was defeated, we have a Tom Suozzi that's defeated next time, who is the most conservative Democratic member in downstate, overlapping with New York City, or Grace Meng, that we get behind these other progressive challengers as much as we did with Jamal Bowman, which is the right thing to do. Because we're only going to make the change if we have victory after victory after victory, if we elect slates, if we have waves of progressives elected all over the country, as we did in 2018. And so this was a great start. In 2018, Democrats, progressives unseated the IDC, which was holding up all progress. There were 8 Democratic elected senators who were caucusing with Republicans, and they were holding up all progress in New York. And since their defeat in 2018, New York has passed electoral reform. They've passed, codified Roe v. Wade. There's a slew of issues that they've been able to pass that were being held up, and there's still way more work to be done. So that is why we can't keep our eye off the ball. We have to remember that, while all eyes may be on one election or 2 elections, there are definitely other folks who are out there working very hard. And sometimes, as I've mentioned in a previous episode, sometimes endorsements come late, and it's great that people are getting endorsed. But if they came earlier, the money that comes in with those endorsements, the press that comes in with those endorsements, it means a lot, but it means even more if you can establish the foundation of your campaign earlier. Progressives are able to defeat these incumbents if they have the foundation of a campaign earlier, if they have the support earlier, if they have the coalitions earlier, and if they can raise the money earlier. It's wonderful having endorsements, especially, after a lot of hard work, but we have to keep in mind that progressives and progressive women, and women of color in particular, have so much more to prove. The types of conversations that they have with voters, it takes them more attempts to convince that voter to vote for them because of implicit bias that still exists, and it still exists on our side. So hoping that what we learn from this election is that more progressive leaders recognize that progressive women, in particular, women of color, face more implicit bias in terms of what their viability is. Can they raise the money? Can they build the infrastructure? Can voters relate to them? We know that when you invest in these candidates early, like folks did with Jamal Bowman, honestly, that people actually relate to them more. I mean, who relates to Eliot Engel? Who related to Joe Crowley? Who relates to some of these people? Not many do, especially if they're not in district. So next time around, I hope that we can get in early as a movement with a lot of these candidates, support them earlier, get them endorsements earlier, get the media earlier, and build those coalitions so that we can win across the board. And we have more than just a handful of wins, but we have dozens of wins, because that's what it's going to take to bring real change. It's going to take more than a small little part of a progressive caucus. It's going to take the progressive caucus being the majority in the House and taking over leadership. On this show, we have, speaking of great leadership, we have Representative Chris Rabb from Pennsylvania. He is one of the most progressive representatives in the country, in my opinion, a longtime activist, friend. He is passing and putting forward transformative criminal justice reform bills out of Pennsylvania. Somebody to watch. It's a great interview. And then later we have Eva Putzova back on from Arizona. She's running for Congress in the 1st District. She's giving us a little bit of an update on what's going on with COVID in Arizona because it's making a lot of news. And then we have Rebecca Parson on, who's a congressional candidate out of Washington State. She's a socialist. She's been getting a ton of attention for, her stances on issues and really bringing heat to that race. And we have Melahat Rafiei on, who is a DNC member out of California, and she talks about how the convention is going to be conducted, virtually in light of COVID and how that reflects on the DNC's process and what happens at the convention. It's a great show. Stick around. And for those of you who've been out there on the streets, make sure to stay well and be healthy and wear your masks. For those of you who are patrons already, from the bottom of my heart and our team's heart, thank you for contributing to our show. It is what has made us grow in these very unusual times. If you're not a patron already, please go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. For as little as $5 a month, you can join and be a patron. We have access to swag now. Different patron levels give you access to that swag, like mugs and totes. Go to thenomikishow.com for that swag. And make sure to click like, subscribe, click those alerts, share on all the social media. That is how our show grows. All around the country, we are hearing about statues being defaced, taken down, with bills being put forward in different legislatures and city councils to take down these statues and other emblems that have been placed all over our country, honoring people who, not just people on the Confederacy, but colonizers, explorers. I say that in quotations for those of you listening on podcast, and just very controversial figures. Our next guest is a friend. He is known in his district as Rep. Rabb. He's a representative for the 200th district in Pennsylvania, Chris Rabb. Also, prior to that, a well-known activist and writer. So even if you didn't know him from Pennsylvania, probably, if you've been around for a while, you knew him from the other world of activism and writing and speaking out. Chris, representative, I should say. Thank you for joining the Nomiki Show. I have to respect you.
Pleasure.
Yes.
It's a beautiful day.
It is. So, Philadelphia, where you represent, you represent the bluest dot, as you call it, in the state.
Yes.
You had the highest turnout with an election that just took place. You're tremendously popular, and you're an actual progressive. How can there be such a beautiful thing? But you've been at the forefront of so many pieces of legislation and activism when it comes to representing the Black community, fully and understanding like the legacy of the horrible legacy that we have in our country. So let's just start off with some of the bills that you've put forward, because I think this is, really important to discuss
Sure.
before we get to the symbolism of taking down these statues.
Sure. Well, I thank you for having me on the show. I've been pretty busy. I was elected the same night as what's his name in 2016. I joined the smallest Democratic minority in the House of Representatives in 61 years. But within 2 years, we had a kind of a blue tsunami, and it looks like there's a chance that Democrats take back the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and potentially the Senate as well. So that's good news. But in the interim, I'm working in a chamber dominated by right-wing extremists. So I've been busy working on things, all justice-oriented, whether it's environmental justice, racial justice, reproductive freedom, so forth. And in this moment, a lot of the bills that kind of languished are now getting more popularity and interest from my constituents and people around the state and around the country, most notably things around police violence. So I have a bill that would create a statewide database so that the police can't pass the trash from one police department to another. They go skulking out of one place before they get fired, they can end up somewhere else and do the same or worse harm in another community, unbeknownst not just to the people who they're supposed to protect and serve, but to the very chiefs of police who hire them, who don't know how bad they are.
Yeah.
This statewide database will protect everyone except those rogue cops. And that's an important thing, because we need that type of transparency and accountability that the Fraternal Order of Police and other apologists claim is not an issue, when in fact police violence has been built into the very notion of policing in this country since 1700 in Pennsylvania. So for 320 years, we have an institution of policing that was based on protecting the social order of white elites and their property. That's really the basis of policing as we know it in the North. And not much has changed in terms of what they protect. And most notably, there's some amazing pictures about them protecting a white racist former mayor of Philadelphia and former police commissioner. And he has this extraordinary statue in front of the municipal building in downtown Philly across from City Hall. And it was spray painted fascist. It was like fake blood put on it. It was all great stuff. The next day, it was whistle clean. It was shining like a beacon of white supremacy the next day, and a whole squadron of police officers protecting it.
This is Frank Rizzo?
That tells you, this is Frank Rizzo. This is the infamous pro-police brutality former mayor, former commissioner. So this tells you about what the priorities are of kind of modern police and historically. So if we're talking about toppling a 320-year institution that has not really changed that much in terms of what it actually does, then we have systemic change that we have to address. And it's not going to be happening by police reforms and just playing around the edges. We have to totally overhaul what we view as policing, and we have to put it in the context of what I call community safety. Because if it's not about community safety, that means that the old notion of protecting and serving is really narrow towards the people and the things that police care about most, which is the property rights of rich white people and protecting white women and girls from the bad people, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at Amy Cooper, right, she could feel comfortable calling and making things up. It didn't matter who the black person was. Right. Just the idea that there was a black man invading the space of a white woman automatically gave her power and affirmed the type of power that these police forces have. And we got to shut that down. If they're truly doing their job, then we're really talking about every community feeling as safe as the next one.
You know, you have a reparations bill that you've put forward. It's a state-based reparations bill, you know, getting to the heart of these systemic issues. Reparations have, I mean, if I could say it this way, it's become an idea that has become normalized in politics in so much that it's been put forward on the presidential platform as an idea. Sort of. This cycle as an idea.
Rhetorically, anyway.
Yes. But I'm saying it from, I think a lot of people outside of the activism world were starting to think about this in a deeper way. And I think it's really fascinating that you've put forward this bill and it's state-based. Could you describe what it represents and you know, what the significance of it would be in Pennsylvania in particular?
Well, so I think what people need to understand, because people are kind of like, if you do it on the state, then the federal government is not going to say, oh, our hands are clean because, you know, states are handling it. Not so. Everyone is culpable. Everyone is complicit. Every institution is touched by slavery and vice versa. But in Pennsylvania, it's important because a lot of people don't know or have forgotten that there was slavery in the North. That's including Pennsylvania colony founded by Quakers who are generally believed to be against slavery. Not so. We had gradual abolition that began in 1780, but the focus was on gradual. So there were enslaved black people in Pennsylvania for 75 years after that law was enacted. And there were many things that were built into state law and policy and the court system that specifically and explicitly excluded and marginalized Black people for generations. And so even our outgoing Speaker of the House of Representatives on the House floor claimed he did not even know that slavery existed in his own state. And the fact that he could even admit this days before he resigned, someone who'd been in office for 20 years and did not know that there was slavery in Pennsylvania was utterly dumbfounding. And so these are people in positions of power. So when we talk about state-based reparations, we are acknowledging the fact that slavery was a state law. It was not a federal law. It was a state law. And every state dealt with slavery differently. So if you believe that slavery and all of the things that came after it, all the systemic racism that still remained after the abolition of slavery impacted Black communities and individuals on a transgenerational level, then you have to repair that damage. And if the government facilitated it through law, through appropriations, through all of these things, then what is that debt? What does that look like? Mm-hmm. Who is eligible? How are those programs created? Are there cash payments? Who is at the table to figure out what this looks like? So this is a complex process. The bill has not been formally introduced yet, but there's tremendous research that my team has begun to make sure that we do it right and use it as a blueprint for other states in the North, including, Nomi, New York.
Oh, shocker.
Where some of my favorite ancestors were enslaved in Manhattan. And there are a lot of Manhattanites who have no idea that, in fact, Manhattan was one of the largest slave
it was. That's why it existed. World. People don't even realize, the history of Manhattan, as opposed to other early cities in the colonies. Other cities were set for freedom of expression of religion, but it was the slave trade route. It was directly from the Caribbean to the port of Manhattan, and that is how banking evolved. So when people say, like, what do you mean economic oppression is racist? And it's like, well, it literally is the design. Capitalism, the design of capitalism, the electoral system is all based on that. So much so that the sin of Manhattan is slavery. And Wall Street.
And Wall Street. All of those things are connected. And the people who owned my people were connected with the Declaration of Independence. So my ninth great-grandfather was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. A very, it was the 1% of colonial America, the Livingstons, who were connected to the Roosevelts and the Bushes and so forth. And they owned hundreds of people in the Caribbean, in New York and other places. And so this is personal to me as a genealogist and family historian, beyond just being a legislator. I've spent 25 years doing this research, and I'm connecting the dots and realizing how much of my personal story relates to policies that have impacted millions of people all over the country. So this is something I'm really looking forward to. I'm happy to update you about its progress, but things can happen. And the reason I was able to pass this bill of mine, this statewide police database, was because all the mass protests inspired a number of Black legislators, myself and others, to take over the House of Representatives. Literally, we shut it down. We commandeered the rostrum of the Speaker of the House, and we would not let them start session, which meant that our colleagues could not get a per diem, and that everything stopped. And we said, we're not going to give up the House floor until you push through substantive legislation that deals with police violence and police accountability. And within 90 minutes, we were at the negotiation table. Within a week, our bills got pushed out of the Judiciary Committee, and a week later, they ran unanimously through the House. Just yesterday, my bill left the House and is going to the Senate and should be on the governor's desk within a matter of days. And that is not because of me. That is because of the thousands and thousands of people across Pennsylvania and across the United States and the globe who are fighting for justice and demanding change. So for all those people who don't believe that protest amounts to anything, you're wrong. You're not on the streets. And if you are, then be affirmed that people are listening and following your leadership because no serious social movement has ever been successful without mass protests. And that is what influences policy, not just the symbolism of monuments and statues, which are important, but ultimately we need to know that there's systemic change afoot because of the work we do on the ground floor.
So you mentioned that, and that's if you're watching mainstream media or have been listening to this debate over statues over the last, let's say last decade, just to keep it fresh.
Sure.
Much of it, you hear folks say, well, that shouldn't be our focus in the movement. That shouldn't be our focus. We should be focusing on these systemic issues. But, now you're seeing people warm up to it that probably weren't so, I've seen people's positions change just in the last few weeks on this. What really stood out to me in the argument was that so many of these statues were put up in the last 100 years. And I don't think I didn't know, I really didn't have any. I mean, obviously with Christopher Columbus, that's an obvious one that I didn't go up when he found, he discovered the Americas, quote unquote, discovered. But let's talk a little bit about that. Like, why did these statues get placed around this country, especially in places that, the North, for instance? Why are there Confederate statues in Pennsylvania?
Right, because, this is my, armchair, psychoanalyst of, what's going on here. I think it's people whose only kind of self-worth comes from whiteness. Like they feel threatened by the browning of America, by, the left having more influence, what have you, all these things. I think they feel they need to find something to hold on to. And for a lot of people who don't know their history, who don't have a lot of self-worth and don't have any substance behind their being, they grasp at anything that makes them feel better than others. And the one thing that so many people can feel that way about is being white, because if you're white, it makes you automatically better than everybody else. And it's a really sick pathology that is easily avoided if you just have decency and basic intellectual curiosity and people who actually don't all look like you. And it's much easier to kind of distance yourself from the mythology around whiteness. The whole Christopher Columbus thing is a joke, because any white person who's upset about it, who, even if they're Italian American, because the guy did this for Spain, number one, right? He didn't discover anything. That's a fact. Right. And he never stepped on U.S. soil, modern U.S. soil. He didn't do any of those things. And he was just a real bastard, right? He was just a really awful human being. And if you're Italian American, you can't think of one person who represents your culture, who represents the best of this country and the old country, then you're just lazy, because there are a lot of folks to choose from. Any ethnic group in this country, whether you're Black or Jewish or Italian American or Greek American, you got to find at least one person that you're really proud of. And if you can't, then it is a farce. And I think for most people who are in Philadelphia, in South Philly, who maybe right now are armed with bats, with golf clubs, with AR-15s. I don't know how many of those white people are actually Italian American, but they are angry white guys who feel threatened because they have little tiny egos and understanding of history. And, I don't know if we can help them. I don't have the energy to do that. Maybe other people can do that. But there is a growing percentage of white folk of all generations who are finally understanding that their fates are intertwined with that of Black and brown folk and indigenous folk. And that's part of the glimmer of hope I have. This is the first time I've seen that type of solidarity ever in the 50 years I've been on this planet. So that's good news. And the other thing is, symbolism matters. Symbolism matters. It is connected to the substance of what we believe. And if we feel that, these institutions are so powerful and these images are so ingrained that nothing can ever change that, and all of a sudden you see the most venerated things start to dissolve, you start to get hope that the institutions that built them up can dissolve too. And that is the type of progress we need to see, where that symbol is connected to substance. And we can and will make that happen because we've done it before.
Yeah. There was an article in the New York Times, I believe it was today or yesterday, and in it they were talking about the statues, and Robert E. Lee Jr., or Robert E. Lee's great-grandson, I believe, was referenced in this piece saying, when he was a kid, he would walk by the statue of his great-grandfather, or great-great-grandfather, I guess you could say, and felt like, oh, that's kind of cool. It's like my name. And then like, oh, he has a nice little feeling. And then over time, as he became educated, it felt a little uncomfortable and he didn't know. And it's the same name. I mean, he lives with that name too. But then it wasn't until he saw a decade ago or so, he saw armed white nationalists protecting the statue that he came out publicly and said that statue needs to go down. So,
well, I got to tell you, that guy is my cousin because Robert E. Lee's father is one of my ancestors. So some of my ancestors are some of the worst white supremacist rapists you could ever imagine. And when I found out about my history doing genealogy when I was in my 20s, shortly after I graduated from college, it was painful to try to find out, to track the footprints of my African ancestors and keep bumping into the people who raped them. Yeah. And that is so much a part of this culture. When we talk about patriarchy, when we talk about violence, it is part and parcel of what it means to be an American. And that's not something we should be proud of. Right. And we have to disassemble these myths and narratives and symbols and substance to get at what we truly want to embrace, to find any greatness, any potential in this country, because we've never achieved it. We've never been anywhere close to it, but we have the possibility only if we work together and we look at these ugly truths and we find beauty by saying, we're not going to pretend it doesn't exist. We're going to learn from it. We're going to learn from it together. And that's a radical thing to do. It's really never been done. The best example I can come up with is abolitionism, because that was multi-ethnic, multi-faith. It was all kinds of folks. And I think we can learn a lot from the abolitionist movement and apply it to modern day times. And I think there's a lot of hope we can have. And I'm not an optimist by nature. I am a student of history. And it's because of that study of history that I feel that we should be affirmed in what we're seeing on the streets and how these mass protests are substantively impacting policies that can move us towards systemic change. The elites do not want to let us believe that we can topple things that seem intractable, seem intransigent, when in fact we absolutely can, because we've done it before.
Chris, you're brilliant. We need more Chris's elected. Oh, I'm so jealous. I'm so jealous that, you're representing Philadelphia. Can you come up to New York when you're done and run for governor?
See if I can annex Queens.
Exactly, it'd be great. Where our governor decided that it was the time to, talk about, not even present a police reform bill. Our Democratic governor, who also thinks, Columbus should be protected because he's a good Italian man. That's Governor Cuomo. Right. So you want to talk to your family members about how Governor Cuomo ain't that great. There's a lot of reasons. That's the best. That's the one of today. Representative Rabb, thank you, Rep Rabb, for doing this great work. And we'd love to have you on when those bills pass. And you're making history, and you've got a great district too. I mean, you're clearly inspiring voters. If you have the highest voter turnout in the state, they see what we see.
I'm a fortunate man. What can I say?
Once again, the DNC is making news for interesting decisions under the leadership of Chairman Tom Perez. If you recall, Tom Perez was elected DNC chair in February of 2017. That was after the tumultuous 2016 election, primary election, which split up the Democratic Party, had a crazy convention. And Keith Ellison, who was a congressman at the time, had run against Tom Perez, and it was a very tight race with many others, including Pete Buttigieg, included in that race. We have one of my favorite DNC members, here to join us because it's now a big question about like how does the convention function, what's going to happen with the convention in light of COVID, and what does it mean for, other than just the illusion of the party and the theatrics of the party, what does it mean for the rules of the party and how the party is structured? Melahat Rafiei is a DNC member out of California. She was just reelected in the midst of COVID, and she's also a political consultant. I've known her working with women. Full disclosure, she's on the board of Matriarch, and we are so grateful to have her leadership and guidance. Melahat, man, did you? Of course you knew because you've been in the DNC for a while, but I think from the get-go, just for our audience who may not be familiar with the politics of the DNC membership, not all DNC members are the same. So sometimes we hear like, the DNC is horrible, and we have to pull back the curtain a little bit and remind folks that there are a lot of personalities and a lot of politics in the DNC. So could you just elaborate on that a bit before we get into the convention?
Sure. The DNC as a whole is one thing, but we're all individual members. As a member, this is my second term. Proximity to power matters when you want to know information. And I've been supportive of Chairman Perez since he was elected. I was, as you know, a whip for Keith Ellison. And so my proximity to power is very far since I was not part of Team Tom from the very beginning. So I'm finding out just as any regular member would find out. So there's no advance notice. But I do agree with what they're doing. I think that a virtual convention is the best way to go. I'm glad that the Democrats are the party of science and facts and reality, and know that this virus is real and it's a real threat to the safety and health of fellow Americans, regardless of political party. And so I'm proud of our party for taking the steps that they have. And there's a lot of unknowns. So at first it was pushing it back a month, not knowing where we would be. And then realizing quickly, and I'm incredibly proud of the leadership team for being able to put together this virtual convention. Do we know what's going to happen? No, but I do know that they've taken care of making sure that we are following the rules and the bylaws. We all voted remotely to have a virtual convention. And we got an email this morning letting us know that there were different platform committee rules and so on and so forth that are going to be virtual starting now. I think I forwarded you that so that you were aware of the schedule. So unprecedented times is something we hear a lot, but trying to operate in that is difficult. You mentioned we had our DNC reelection here in California in the midst of COVID, and it went from being in person to being virtual to just communicating with our executive board members by phone or by text. And it was different than we normally expect. We didn't have the results for over 2 months because of the shelter-in-place order here in California. And so, some of those things I think about as being first world problems when we have the communities of color so much affected with the disparity of how they're affected with this illness. And those are the things I want to focus on, is how we get back to winning in America, how we get the White House back, how we maintain our lead in the House and expand on that. We saw some really awesome primary turnouts a couple of days ago where the progressive wing and progressive winning. We see a sea shift, and then just most importantly, take back the White House.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think what the criticism was from what I was seeing from DNC members in a very public way that, just to remind folks, like, this kind of public criticism doesn't happen a lot in the Democratic Party. And it's really since 2016 that you're seeing these complaints openly aired and criticisms openly aired since under Howard Dean, the lead up, yes, like I would say every decade or so you have these little divisions. But this is like a whole other level. They're talking about how votes are conducted, how transparency works, is there accountability, do people know what's in the budget? I mean, you and I are very familiar with these kinds of conversations. And so when you look at the fact that the platform committee, which I was on in 2016, is taking place the beginning of July. There's the drafting committee hearing end of June to beginning of July, and mid-July. They have 4 meetings there. These are appointed positions. We have to be very clear about that. They weren't elected. The platform, in 2016, Bernie was able to get a few key members of the platform committee, and Hillary had the majority. And it was aired publicly, and people were very involved in the process. And it made great TV because, of course, there were people like Neera Tanden and then like Keith Ellison and Cornel West. I mean, it was a beautiful expression of democracy that led up to the platform voting. meeting, which I was on, the general, it was also all appointed people. So none of us were elected to those positions. And I think what's frustrating for a lot of DNC members like yourself, who work very hard, who spend money, raise money to get elected, is that they're left out of these very critical and crucial conversations like, what is the platform of the Democratic Party going to look like? What are the rules of the Democratic Party going to be? Because those committees, for the most part, are appointed either by the chairman himself or by the presidential, the top contenders, the presidential primary, which, is understandable, but oftentimes those people reflect campaign staff and not the DNC members who put their blood, sweat, and tears, go to every single meeting. So, I find it interesting that in light of all of this, DNC members do get to go to the convention and vote on big pieces, but it's after it's been delivered as a package. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. And I don't think it's just this administration. It's kind of unfortunately been the way that it's been going. And you're right. Since 2016, and, for me, candidly, I wasn't there before 2016. I have seen a change in how people are reacting. And now that I'm not an outsider completely, sort of an insider, not insider enough to know what's going on ahead of time, but insider with a title, I suppose, I understand the frustration. And I just at the national party, but we have the same complaints at different state parties as well. Yeah. And what I want to say is rules, that's how the system is built. Whether you're progressive or moderate, at the end of the day, we're Democrats. We have these changes to make. But for example, in California, Senator Sanders won the primary. He had the bulk of the delegates. And when you win, one of the Biden delegates sent us me an email saying, when you win, you get to pick the leader. And they picked Congressman Ro Khanna instead of. And that's what happens when you win in numbers. So to me, what that means is you just got to win bigger. Instead of complaining about the system, try to change the system and just win bigger. We have to work twice as hard on our side to get half as far. The system, whether it's internally or externally, was built this way. It's not broken. This is how it was built. Right. It was built in a way to keep the agitators out. And you and I are agitators in some way, nice agitators, but agitators nonetheless. Agitators nonetheless. I consider pragmatic progressive. I want to see things get done, not just squabble about it internally, but really make changes. I come from a place where I think all of us who are involved at this level, voluntarily, you're right, we spend our own money. We don't make money doing this. This is not part of a career-building exercise for any of us. We take time from our families. We do all of that to be part of this. And we're not, everyone I engage with, whether I agree with them or not, they're doing this for what I think is the right reasons. They want to make the party better. They want to make our country better. And it's not going to be easy. We're not going to come in and just fix it. We have a lot of headway to make.
At least, just to be clear, the people that are on the agitator side are in it. I mean, there's plenty of folks in the DNC who do make money off of this. And, they tend to be the ones that are not elected. They tend to be the ones that are appointed. So there is an internal system that, is not just there to leave out the agitators, but also to reward people who are calcifying the system to be more about money than it is about people.
Well, I want to say, when we made those reforms in 2016, I know you were a big part of that change. I think we missed the boat. And I would have these conversations with people without being critical, but the problem wasn't the superdelegates, okay? Right. Like me, I wasn't the problem, someone who was elected through the executive board of my state party. The problem are the appointments. Yep. And these appointments were supposed to be to diversify, so we would make sure that it wasn't an all-white caucus or this or that. But what's ended up happening is, you're right, it's the lobbyists who happen to demographics. So hey, we've got someone who's LGBT. Hey, we've got someone who's Black. Hey, we've got someone who's Latino. Oh, by the way, they're the kind of Black, Latino, or LGBT who's going to make sure that our centrist candidates move forward. I get that. Believe it or not, in many parts of my state, I'm considered a centrist corporate Democrat. I know. I laugh about it too. I think Howard Dean and the others who I started with would laugh about it too. But when you've been in for as long as you have, anyone who comes in new thinks you're establishment and a certain way. So you hear that a lot.
Well, and it's also, people have to understand, this is party politics too. So it's not necessarily, it's not full activism. Like, the people that you're going to have in party politics are more familiar with the mechanics of party politics. But I've seen your work. You've been on the left side of pretty much everything, and you've been very respectful of how the process works, but you've also been very critical and clear. And I think, because you're not burning down the house doesn't mean that you don't agree with the people burning down the house, frankly. And I mean, just to go back to the convention a little bit, I think what's so confusing is like how this is going to happen. Is it over Zoom? Like, how do you, they say that the votes are going to be honest, but, even in person, we all know that the voting is oftentimes like they'll pull out a rule out of nowhere and they'll say, oh, well, it's up to the chair's determination whether or not we count the mail-in ballots or whatever it is. I mean, there's always some sort of thing that happens in the final hours where they're like, they either completely ignore an existing rule or they use a rule to strengthen their argument when it gets really close. And so I think the concern of a lot of folks right now is that's going to be worsened because, there should be transparency in the party and there's already a level that's not, probably up to our standards, in which they use to their advantage. And how does that play out over Zoom or like virtual convention?
Sure. So we've had local committee meetings and state meetings. I was on the rules committee for the state party for 5 hours on Zoom. Okay? And we all had to vote. We had to vote on resolutions to amend how we're holding our local elections. We had to vote on things at the local level, on BLM resolutions, on a lot of things. And it's all done through virtual. And a big part of it is, I don't know how you log in. I mean, we're almost having these conspiracy theories that all mail-in ballots are going to be hacked or something. And when you're logging in, you have to have some sort of ID. You have to be visually you. They won't let you log in without naming yourself. For example, we have a DNC delegates call, California delegation call this Sunday. I have a specific code that's just mine that I log in with. In the email, it's clear if my staff or anybody else tries to use it, we'll both be locked out. So I don't have the answers. I don't think they have the answers, but I genuinely believe, and I'm a glass half full kind of person, they're trying their best to find out. I think transparency is important. Perhaps they're not showing us because they're not doing yet. I mean, a lot of it is that people just don't know what they're doing. And how we avoid having the chair or anybody in leadership take those weird rules. I mean, at the end of the day, Nomiki, everything is at the chair's discretion. That's the way the rules are written. Everything is at the chair's discretion. We're having this internal fight at the California Democratic Party as well. And those are the things you have to decide. How much are you willing to strip the powers of the chair when one day your person might be chair, your woman, your man might be chair. So that's really important, I think. And Tom Perez does respond when we're pushing. I think it's important that before this stuff gets open, we're clear what our expectations are. I don't even think we're clear about what we're expecting. They're getting, yes, everyone's complaining, but they're complaining from different parts. Our complaints are not organized.
No, they're not.
We don't have one system, one group saying, here's what we're demanding, here's what we want. People are just screaming into the ether and wondering why no one's listening to them. Right. So, like I said, I'm a pragmatic progressive. I think fighting within our own is not the smartest things done. Have discussions. We all want this to work. And if we're not together and we're fractured, we are letting Donald Trump win again.
Well, and some of that, I think, comes from the pressure of outside organizations that don't have anybody on the inside to really show them the way. It can be very effective in ways that, like, that sunlight brings, awareness and pressure brings awareness. But I think it also helps when, for instance, I just remember the meeting over climate, and this is something that's brought up. This wasn't the first time. This is a bill that was brought forward, by the way. Christine Pelosi, who's Nancy Pelosi's daughter of all people, was the one who presented this, as she has getting money out of corporate money out of the Democratic Party and lobbyist money out of the Democratic Party, which is really where the division started in the DNC. And so, to see the pushback there from the outside was really powerful. But if you don't know the rules, what you didn't realize is they just passed it on to the next meeting and to the next meeting and to the next meeting, and it's never being voted on. So if you really want actual progress, it is important to actually understand those internal structures. And so sometimes you see, I know people are saying we need to elect Bernie to get on the ballot, so we have Bernie people on the Rules Committee, and I agree with that sentiment, for the most part, and that's a Larry Cohen sentiment, and I truly do. But I think the ship is passed on that, frankly. Having gone through the worst moments of reform when Bernie had all the leverage, we still couldn't get things done. And now that Bernie has no leverage, for the most part, I think it really does come down to people in the DNC taking the leadership, going back to what you're saying, getting organized, getting a message, not looking to external groups who don't have representation on the inside to lead. You work with the external groups, but there are enough reformers in the DNC now, because of 2016, that you guys can lead the way.
Well, I'll tell you, we are having conversations, and because we don't have the information, we don't want to go out on the attack or ask for demands until we know what's happening. So I really think after this Sunday's call, the group of us that have been asking questions will be able to, we're communicating constantly. But what you just said, Christine Pelosi, of all people, right. Christine is one of the most progressive members of our delegation.
It's so crazy. This is just to show you the spectrum right now, guys.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. It's like one of the things that you should note is some of the folks who voted against the climate debate were not reelected to the California delegation. Okay?
Oh, right. Bob Mulholland. Yeah.
Yes. So they weren't reelected to a delegation. So that matters. Incremental change is painful and slow, but it's happening. I've seen the change because of the, agitators from the outside coming in, because it's important to have. And it is happening. So I don't want us to get deflated when we're not seeing everything we want the way we want it. Trust me, we're making it uncomfortable for everybody on the inside.
Oh yeah, they're freaking out. I mean, how many memos get leaked, and they try to kick people off of the appointed committees, but for every Jim Zogby or Ray Buckley, they pull off the rules committee. 10 people get elected to the DNC that are agitators, and it's great. It's refreshing, and and then you get the old crusty people. Who, I mean, when I say they're old and crusty, I mean their egos are. I don't think that I am. I don't think I'm over articulating. I don't know what the right way of saying this is. That some of these people are just like really bad people. Like they work with weapons manufacturers, they work with big oil, or what's worse, they don't work with any of them. They just love themselves so much that they think that they're entitled to these positions and just suppressing the left. Well, a lot of those folks are getting voted out if they were voted in, and that is change. Maybe not at the rate that we all want to see, but that will happen if we have a chair that is more reflective of us. And I think, that's where we pressure Biden to put somebody in that's not just like whatever their version of woke corporate person is.
I think we'll know a lot by whoever is picked to be the vice presidential nominee. And again, as frustrated as we all were, it shouldn't just be the Bernie people. It should be the Warren people. It should be everybody that was on that side. And coming together, I know a lot of friends who supported both candidates, who supported a lot of the candidates, who maybe supported Joe Biden. At this point, everybody just wants to get to November and to be able to be successful. And then internally fix the party even more. Yeah, we have a lot of new members in California. There are new members being elected the country, and the goal is transparency and access, because what's actually happening on the ground is not happening at the national level. What we're doing in the clubs and the local parties and what's happening in the states and all the races that we're winning, and you're seeing it, these primaries amid a pandemic. Right. We're getting high voter turnout, and we're getting rid of incumbents that have been there for decades and decades and decades. And all these old crusty people you're talking about, what gender are they and what race are they? Mm-hmm. Exactly. That's changing too. And it's slow and it's painful, and hopefully and we're 70 years old, we'll see more of it, and we'll be able to say we were part of the beginning of this. But it's happening, my friend, it's happening. Thanks to you and so many people like you who are willing to stand up, who are not worried about getting nasty tweets from people, who are not worried about the establishment, because we're going to become the establishment.
Yeah. No, it's happening. For every Elliott angle, there's 20 of them in the DNC. If you think Congress is bad, look at DNC. Melahat, as always, great to talk to you. Love the updates. Thank you for telling us a little bit more about what's happening internally, because the other thing is, like, reporters only recently started reporting on what's happening at the DNC, and in light of what's happening right now in the world, I think it's some of this stuff that's happening in the shadows doesn't necessarily get exposed to the nation. So thank you for your work.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for keeping everyone's feet to the fire.
Thank you for watching and listening to the Nomiki Show. Make sure to click like and subscribe on YouTube and share with everybody on social media. And of course, if you're not a patron already, please join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for as low as $5 a month. That money makes a huge difference. We don't have the corporate money coming in. We're not cable news that's raking in the dough from advertisers right now as everybody's sitting at home and watching. It is really you guys who are keeping us together. So please consider being a patron. And for those of you who have already, we are incredibly grateful to you. our continuous series highlighting the fantastic working class progressive women running for Congress that are matriarch candidates, we lead you to Washington's 6th District, which has a primary on August 4th. Rebecca Parson is running for Congress in that district. She is bringing the socialism to the district. She's fiery on Twitter. We love what she has to say, and my God, if she gets to Congress, I just can't wait to see how she blows things up in a figurative way. So Rebecca, thank you so much for joining.
Hi, Nomiki. Thanks so much for having me. Excited.
So, okay, the general question is, why did you decide to run?
Well, I'm running because the 6th District has been blue for 55 years, yet we have the 11th most conservative Democrat in the House representing us, and that has a real impact on the quality of life for people in the district. Now, he's been in office for quite some time now, yet we have homelessness on the rise. We have 24% of the district on Social Security, yet he signed a letter calling for Social Security cuts, supporting Mitt Romney's plan to do that. We have people who are, they can barely afford the rent if they even can. People who can't get a good job. There's a big part of my district that used to have a thriving timber industry. It collapsed. No jobs have replaced a lot of that. So we also have the top 2 counties in the state for opioid-related deaths. So we have a lot of issues here that are not being addressed by our current representation. And additionally, with the Green New Deal, he just refuses to support it. He refuses to stop taking fossil fuel money. And we just don't have much time. We only have until 2030 to make big, bold change to the economy and getting it to renewable energy. So that's why I decided to run.
Wow. The sad thing is I hear these stories over and over, and they always shock me, but they're all very similar. When you hear about who's representing us in the House, who's coming out of these traditionally very Democratic districts, and it's really mind-boggling. Because Washington State is probably like more, I would say, populist in terms of at least electoralism. So it's horrifying that you'd have a legislator, a lawmaker who would be taking such conservative positions. Your background, tell us a little about where you come from, what you're going to bring to the table when you're elected to Congress.
Yeah, well, I grew up moving around overseas because my dad was in the U.S. Foreign Service, and we moved back to the States when I was 12. And I grew up moving around a lot. That's what I was used to. But when I moved to Tacoma, I really fell in love with it. I felt like I finally found my home and where I wanted to be. And while I've been here, I've done stuff like I'm a commissioner on the Tacoma Commission on Disabilities, co-led my local Indivisible group for a year and a half. I was a court-appointed special advocate for kids in foster care in my county. And I've been really involved in lots of different ways. But after 2016, I wanted to move beyond what I had been doing politically, which was voting and paying attention, but, really get more involved in the process. And that's when I found out so much more about our district and how out of touch with the district's needs and also just Democrats in Washington, our representative is. I'm also a renter. I would be one of the few people who's not a millionaire and not a homeowner in Congress. And so I can really relate to the huge increases in rent. I mean, Tacoma, it may surprise people to learn, we're not as expensive a rental market as somewhere like New York or San Francisco, but out of everywhere in the country, we're one of the top for the rate at which rent is increasing. So it's really severe, the housing crisis here, and government is just not doing enough to solve it. And then in the rest of the district where there's more home ownership, there just isn't enough rental stock. And, Aberdeen in my town, that's where Kurt Cobain, Aberdeen, which is a town in my district, it's where Kurt Cobain was from. Has a population of 16,000 and 1,000 homeless people.
Wow.
So you just imagine 1 in 16 people are homeless. That shows you the scale of the problem. And they just get their empty houses all around Aberdeen. And that district, that county, it also is one of the top 2 that I mentioned, the state for opioid-related deaths. And they don't have a single treatment facility that takes Medicaid. So people literally die because of that.
Not a treatment facility that takes Medicaid?
Mm-hmm.
In a state that's led by, are you kidding me? Wow.
Yeah. And unfortunately, out of our delegation, Pramila Jayapal is amazing. Yeah. Some other representatives are good on certain issues, but we really don't have the progressive representation that really matches our our politics. Bernie Sanders took this district in 2016, very close second in this cycle. We also have a long populist history in this district. There were about 10 IWW chapters in the state. There was local socialist organizing in Aberdeen, which I just mentioned. There were a lot of socialists organizing there. There was a socialist hall. You can even see a picture that a local historian tweeted of 500 socialists gathering together in 1911 in Aberdeen, the local socialist club. There's a long 100-year plus history of populist left-wing organizing in this district. And people ask me, well, what about the conservative voters in the rural parts of your district? Well, if you ask a lot of them, even the Republicans, their favorite politician is FDR. And that's because he was the last president to visit their communities, and because there were 7 civilian conservation corps camps on the Olympic Peninsula. So the federal jobs program, people want these populist policies.
That's fascinating. I mean, the Northwest has had this, the longshoresmen, it's where so much, the roots of so much of our labor has, radical labor transformed our country. Also has, there's also horrible history from FDR that, is on the table as well. We have to mention that. But, it is refreshing hearing you openly talk about socialist ideas, and it's not coming from Queens or parts of Brooklyn, and even at the state level. I live in Queens. We have a very active Queens socialist DSA membership. But with that being said, they sometimes even DSA members will speak in code when running. You're not. And how has that? You say there's Republicans. How have they responded to your just open DSA membership, all of the history that you talk about? How are they responding to it?
A lot of people don't know about that history, even though many of them probably have a father or grandfather who was a wobbly because of how many locals there were. And but people also remember, there were horrible Union massacres in this area, right, and they remember the history. And so when I talk about it in that way, where it's homegrown, it's part of our history and our tradition, and I'm just going back to our history and tradition by coming with these populist policies. And I also, when I'm talking to people, over a year ago, I was out canvassing in Aberdeen with a local group that's trying to make sure the Green New Deal benefits rural Washington and not just cities. And we didn't say anything about Democrat, Republican, DSA. Right. We were just talking about the Green New Deal. And have you heard of it? Here's a little bit about it. And then we showed them a list of policies and asked which of these would be most important to you to have part of the Green New Deal. Stuff like jobs guarantee with family wage union jobs, a free education so you can get trained for new jobs in the new economy, childcare, all the parents are working, or both parents, more parents are working, we're going to need childcare. So a list of policies like that. And people who voluntarily told us, we didn't ask, they told us they were Trump voters. They would look at this list and say, well, I don't know, it's hard to choose because I really like all of these policies. And so if you just come to people and you talk about the policies, how it'll impact their life, right, and do it that way, and they don't feel like anything's being pushed down their throat, or that it's not partisan. When people ask me, well, how do you work with people across the aisle? That's a common question. It's just, well, I'll work with people across the aisle when it doesn't mean compromising my values. For example, cutting Social Security is an absolute no, and I will never cross that line. But there are things where if you look at certain bills, you'll see that basically the Squad and Justin Amash are the only people who voted in one area of it, and it's usually around privacy.
I was like, let me guess.
And so there are certain issues where I would have something in common with a libertarian like Justin Amash, and that's where I would vote with that person on it. So there are ways to work across the aisle that don't mean going Republican corporate light. Yeah,
it's interesting. There was this old concept, at least in the 2000s, when John Kerry got annihilated, that all the Democrats and all these new organizations that popped up that were left-leaning said, we got to meet people where they are. They understood that there was a disconnect happening, and the communications trainings were always find out where that voter is. But we do live in this extremely polarized, intentionally polarized, strategically polarized country that brings profits to not just the media, but to all these organizations that pop up to defeat the other side. And so, on one hand, it seems like we're further apart than we've ever been. But then when you talk about these populist ideas, that's the great unifier. And I think what you're saying is can be duplicated wherever you are. If you're in a big city, if you're in a rural community, I mean, people just want to have a fair shot at life, and they see that government and whatever they want to point fingers to is not providing it. The root is often what is to be debated. But do you find that when you talk to folks and you kind of get them in that circle, you meet them where they are, sometimes they think that like, okay, well, maybe what Donald Trump says is the problem, and you say, well, actually, it's really this instead. Are people open to that switch about what the root problem is?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's something we walked through when we were doing this Green New Deal canvassing. We would start by saying, hi, we're doing, what's your, ask about cost of living, basically. And like people would say, well, housing is too high, or can't afford to send my kids to college, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And we'd say, well, who do you think is responsible for that? And then give some suggestions. And then they would, well, our landlords, or, Walmart not paying us enough, or stuff like that. And you can talk with people like that. And what's really interesting is that, for example, Grace Harbor, where Aberdeen is, it went for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. That was the first time it had gone Republican in 90 years. And wow. Yeah. And the centrist corporate Dem response is we need to get even more centrist in corporate Dem and Republican light. But that is not what they want. And I've looked at the results for this year's primary, and there are precincts in Aberdeen where all these precincts are right next to each other. This one, Bernie, Trump, Bernie, Trump, Bernie, Trump, Bernie, Trump. Why is that? Is that because Bernie went more Republican and became Republican light? No, it's because Trump presents himself as a populist. Bernie actually is a populist. What they want is populism. And so it's just that they want somebody who's addressing the root problems in their life. And so I don't find an issue around that. And I think a real problem that Democrats have as well is that they look down on people often. And it's just kind of, the more educated you are, the better of a person you are, and you know what's best for people. But people actually know what's best for themselves. And I actually read an article that poverty went down during the coronavirus pandemic. So shocker, it turns out that when you give people money, poverty goes down. I mean, I don't need a PhD to figure that one out. And like people who have just a high school, they have a high school education, or they have an associate's degree or something, like they know what's best for their life. They know what they need. They need money and a job and an education and a house to live in. And so you do not have to come at them with this kind of looking down on them or deigning to speak with them. Lots of people who we call, or before the pandemic we were canvassing, never had a politician come to their door. And I know what that's like, because no politician ever comes to my door. The only people who come to my door are salespeople, missionaries, and a mail carrier. So,
which we, hopefully we'll still have that after this election, the mail carrier. So let's just talk a little bit about the election before we wrap up, because I think we have to ask these questions. We're in COVID. Your primary is on August 4th. How are votes going to be cast?
Well, we're fortunate here because we already had mail-in voting, and there are a few polling places, mainly for people with disabilities, so that they can use a machine that they can actually use to vote. But really, the vast majority of it is mail-in. There are drive-by ballot boxes. Here, progressives tend to vote at the last minute, which kind of like, is a stressor for people. That's how Sarah Smith in the last cycle, she ended up, getting over at the last minute. But so essentially, it's mail-in. So I don't think we're going to face a lot of issues. Like, the system here is very well run. We also have same-day voter registration. There is no party registration, right. So we have pretty high turnout. So things are looking really good there. We also have a top 2 primary, like California, if people are familiar with that. So what that means is that everybody will run in the primary against each other. And for me, that's 4 Republicans, the incumbent Democrat, and me, all running against each other in the primary. And the top 2 people the top 2 vote getters will advance to the general. In my district, in the last 2 elections, last 2 congressional elections, the Republicans got exactly 32.7% of the vote. When it was one of them, he got that amount. And when there was more than one, their vote total added up to that.
Wow.
So that seems to be their base. And with 4 of them running, they're likely to just split their base. So things are looking pretty good. It has been a challenge with the pandemic, not doing any canvassing, but we have already made 300,000 phone calls to voters. And we have people all over the district and the country, up to 50 phone bankers a day. And so people are really resonating with the message, and we're doing really well, especially because our 24% of our district on Social Security and the incumbent signing a letter calling for Social Security cuts. I mean, our base is what you would think of for a populist DSA person running for Congress, with the addition of seniors. They really support our message. So I'm excited.
What is the turnout usually like in terms of numbers?
Very high, like over 100,000.
Woo.
Yeah.
So just to put that in perspective for folks who are paying attention to these races in New York, looking at the numbers, nowhere near that. I mean, granted, I should say that the mail-in votes have not been cast yet, but primaries, for the most part in New York, have been fairly low turnout because of our restrictive voting laws that have just recently changed. Alternatively, Washington State has pretty strong voting laws in terms of open primaries, and now you have the jungle primary, which is questionable, but you have the California system. But I mean, it just shows you the difference. Like in some of these races, I think 25,000 people showed up total. In some of the local races, I looked at some of these state Senate races, 3,000 people voted total. So to see a vibrant primary like that's pretty great. And I think that bids well for, hopefully, knock on wood, wherever that is, for a populist.
Yeah, I hope so. And
found the wood.
People are really open to the message, and I'm excited. Voting starts on July 17th, so it's coming up really quickly.
Great. So how can people help out if they want to join your campaign in any way?
You can donate. I don't take any corporate PAC or lobbyist money. Go to RebeccaForWA.com, click on the red donate button. Any amount helps. My average donation last time I checked was $17.
Awesome.
You can also volunteer. Go to the events page. You'll be taken right to the sign up to volunteer. If you've never phone banked, don't worry. We train you, provide you with everything you need. You don't use your personal phone number. You just do it from home on your computer. And that would be a great way to sign up and help us as well.
Great, Rebecca. Best of luck, and we'll be watching you very closely.
Thanks.
As you're probably seeing, there are parts of the country that are seeing spikes in COVID rates. Parts of the country that did not have spikes early on, that opened up their economies without any sort of gradual opening of the economy. No plans, no phases, just a sudden opening up of the economy. And these parts of the country tend to have Republican leadership. And now you're seeing these spikes where hospitals don't have beds, just horrifying numbers. And, I'm in Arizona right now, as many of you know, with my family. So I'm thinking about these things very closely. But there's also a congressional candidate that we've had on the show recently, Eva Putzova, who represents a swath of Arizona, from northern Arizona all the way down to southern Arizona, to the Oro Valley area. Eva Putzova, thank you for coming back. You're running for Congress in Arizona's 1st District. You are a former council member of Flagstaff. So if you look at a map, that's pretty far away from Tucson. But simultaneously, there's also wildfires here that are growing at a rapid rate. So all eyes are on Arizona, and I figured you're a great person to talk about what's happening.
Thank you, Nomiki, for having me. And yes, while today the national news covers Arizona extensively, for the last essentially 2-3 months, we've seen a huge uptick in COVID-19 cases. And specifically on the reservation, we've heard, everybody heard that the Navajo Nation is actually #1 in its COVID-19 infection rate in the country. So even before Arizona became the topic of the national news, the Navajo Nation has been right in front of us as an area where we completely missed to protect people. And we see the rest of Arizona, because we opened up, even though before, different cities have obviously different standards of protection. Suddenly, for some weird reason, our governor thought, hey, let's just open things up. And then it's obviously not just the reservation now anymore, but it's also the rest of the state, that it's a hotbed of the public health crisis again. And what's interesting, so different cities, governor decided that, the cities now can regulate whether people are required to wear masks or not. And so cities around Arizona, those mayors who actually care about their population, issued proclamations in which they require people to wear masks. And so Flagstaff and Phoenix and actually Coconino County, at least those few I know of, there are more who require masks. And it's interesting, somebody pointed out that even when we have the same message, we don't have the same message, because different jurisdictions require wearing of mask starting at different age. So Flagstaff, it's from age 5 and above. In Phoenix, it's 6 and above. Coconino County is from the age 2 and above. Mm-hmm. So it's this is kind of emblematic of the fact that we have no system, we have no really public health system that all of us can rely on for good information, for consistent information, and for policies that would move us forward together.
I mean, it's astounding that it's not, the government here hasn't even been reactive. It's been ignorant to what's happening. They've been more concerned with business opening up and how it affects the economy, and less concerned about how the crisis, this health crisis, would affect the economy. I mean, there is a significant elderly population in Arizona. I mean, there's a lot of snowbirds who come down here to live. There are entire cities that are made up of retirement communities. And, we see that the rates will spike. I mean, in New York, there was a huge nursing home crisis that Governor Cuomo took, part in essentially covering up, that led to spikes and dozens of deaths. And we're seeing it here too. And these are our more vulnerable members of the community. But what's really interesting about these numbers is it's actually coming from young people, not necessarily because young people are out partying or being ignorant. It's that they have jobs to go to. So if your business says, okay, we're opening up, as long as you want to stay employed, you have to show up, even if you don't necessarily agree. So it's putting people at risk, even if they're forced to wear masks as an employee, someone who's visiting that business may not be wearing the mask. And so, we know the rules now, we know how this spreads. And it's pretty jarring to see how incompetent the government has been. And now you have a Trump rally that is going to take place in Arizona. And we saw the last Trump rally. Well, the attendance was lower than, by far lower than they expected. Most people, I mean, pretty much almost everybody that maybe didn't work there, the rally was not wearing masks. And they were, even though the stadiums were empty, they were all squished together. And you compare that to, say, the protests where people are wearing masks, and they see that because people are wearing masks, these protests, you're not seeing a spike, but it's likely to be just the opposite with the rally. And so, with Arizona in crisis already, in a health crisis, and then seeing a rally like this exist, continue to be planned. I mean, what are you hearing? How are our leaders that believe that this is a health crisis, believe in science, how are they responding and reacting to what's going on?
So frankly, I do think that we have a huge void of leadership when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. And, it's been almost from the beginning, and it's, the combination of lack of leadership at the national level, at the state level, even at the county and local level. And I really think this is a problem. And, the COVID-19 pandemic also illuminated the huge deficiencies we have in protecting labor. The fact that businesses can open up, and even if they require the employees to wear masks, the businesses are hesitant to require the customers to wear masks to protect their own employees. And there is no force locally, at the state level, at the national level, that is going to say that, no, you cannot allow customers who are not wearing masks into your business. And so again, we are putting profit, and I should say short-term profit, because this is not good for business in the long run either. The longer this crisis persists, the worse the economic impact will be on the businesses. And so we do have to, there is, what I hear is that there is interest in strengthening these labor protections. And it's not just in businesses that you would expect, like restaurants or retail, but also our universities. Faculty at the Northern Arizona University, and I'm sure that it's the same at ASU and UOA, are so worried because the president said they would open up the campuses to student population this fall, which, this fall is going to start in early August for the universities. So they are concerned that there is no way to enforce social distancing. They concern how they're going to enforce as instructors, as faculty in the classrooms. And it is a big mess. That's what I see. And I am very worried that instead of, this crisis being a 6-month, maybe, 8-month, 12-month crisis, we're going to be talking about this next year around this time again.
Yeah, I mean, that's horrifying. I look at New York where I live, and I was listening to local radio, public radio there, and they were interviewing the head of a university in New York, and they said, no, we're not. I mean, this is after New York the rates have dropped significantly. And, and there was a lot of mismanagement in New York too, with New York leadership in terms of responsiveness and listening to the cues from the CDC, and it's interesting that, like, even though the rates have gone down so much and they have completely flattened the curve, they're still not having school in the fall. So the fact that we have Arizona with these extraordinary spikes and the institutions that people, especially the right wing likes to label as lefty, I mean, institutions that we know believe in science are still staying open. I just don't understand how local leadership, whether it's the legislature or city councils or mayors, are not pushing back on that, because it's complete incompetence, and it's going to be, the rise in numbers is going to be something that those leaders are going to have to respond to and answer to.
Yeah, and I think what we see from some of these institutions, including in Arizona, is just reflection of the fact that we no longer have true public universities. Right. These are revenue-driven institutions that rely mostly on tuition revenue, and they are behaving as for-profit businesses. They're going to try to figure out how to open up because they want to see those tuition dollars coming to their institutions. And, that is not safe. It's not wise. And sometimes, the cities would say probably that, we don't have the authority. We don't have the power to enforce something. And obviously, the state universities are exempt from any local laws, any ordinances, right? But I think this is the responsibility, even when you do not have the authority. You are the one that should model and should talk about this. Like, I see this in Flagstaff. There is complete lack of leadership when it comes to COVID-19 management of the public crisis. What I would expect from local leaders, county leaders, is to talk every single week, to have press conferences and talk about what is important that we have to do. Even when you don't have the authority to enforce certain rules, you should still try to impose those rules and model those rules, because we know that it works. when, even the simple thing when City of Flagstaff issued proclamation that everybody is now required to wear masks if they come to a business or if they are in an enclosed area where social distance is impossible. Suddenly you see higher compliance with that. So people do actually respond to regulation positively, and we should be not relaxing the rules, but we should really realize that we are not out of the water yet. This is going to be a long time, and we better learn how to live with these protections in place for months and months on end.
Yeah, it really comes down to, it takes a village. It can't just be one person staying at home. I mean, that person still has to get groceries, and it's a risk no matter what. Eva, when's your election, your primary?
So August 4th is the big day, but our early voting starts on July 8th, which is 13 days away.
Oh, we are getting close.
That's just around the corner. And so this is really the kind of finish line, the final stretch for the campaign. And we are working very, very hard, reaching as many voters as possible. Nomiki, I was going to mention one thing about COVID-19, because I think this is something that we don't talk about because it's out of our sight. About our county jail population, with incredible risk of contracting COVID-19. And this is the time when the county sheriff offices should be really revising their approach to detention. And we have a case in Navajo County. Here we launched a petition to free Nico Wilson, who has been held without a bail in a county jail for a probation violation, and he was he was convicted of transporting marijuana back in 2003, and in 2006 he violated his probation by getting engaged in some other case, and it's 2020 and he was detained for that probation violation, and he's asthmatic, and there is an outbreak of COVID-19 at the Navajo County jail. And so we, as the civilian population, people who are on the outside, don't think about people who are institutionalized and how this COVID-19 crisis can impact their health. And if the viewers can go to change.org and just search for Free Nico, you'll see the petition that we signed, and you'll learn about his case. And he's not the only person. Obviously, this is a problem around the country.
Yeah. Free Nico, N-E-K-O, right? It's not
N-E-K-O.
Okay, perfect. Eva, thank you for sharing that. These are the stories. It's just, when you're in the middle of these crises, there's so many layers of stories that maybe will never come out. Unfortunately, capitalism never lets a crisis go to waste. And so I'm sure we're going to be seeing and hearing more that are like his story. And we are just in immediate response, and it's just going to get worse. But that's why we need to get people like yourself elected. We need to fill that leadership vacuum that they're not stepping up to the crisis at hand. So thank you so much for joining us again. We'll be watching your race super closely. Early voting starting on July 8th, correct?
Correct.
Perfect. All right, Eva, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to Rep. Rabb, Chris Rabb out of Pennsylvania, and to Melahat, Rafiei, and Rebecca Parson, and Eva Putzova. Be well, be safe, wear your masks. If you're hitting the streets, thank you so much, but definitely be careful. Take care of your loved ones as well, and we'll see you next week.